it's just about time, so I'll kick off. My name's Adrian Reed, and I'm a lead business analyst and trainer for a UK-based consultancy called Blackmetric Business Solutions. Now, my presentation today is entitled Enterprise Analysis, the Importance of the Why and the What. And we heard Paul, my colleague Paul's talk earlier today. You would have heard him talk about how a lot of organisations focus on doing things right, but there isn't always the focus on doing the right things to start with. So you end up in that kind of mad dash to deliver something, but perhaps it's not the right thing to deliver in the first place. So my presentation today is going to really build on some of the ideas that Paul mentioned in his presentation, and talk about how, as a group of business analysts, requirements engineers, we can ensure that our organisations are doing the right things to start with. So, in the relatively short time that I've got today, I'm going to cover three main angles of enterprise analysis. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what it is, and put a definition around it. I'm then going to talk a little bit about when it happens. So if you think about a typical project life cycle, I'll talk about when enterprise analysis might take place. But most of my presentation today is dedicated to showing a thin slice of enterprise analysis in practice. So I'm going to show you some tools and techniques that me and my colleagues have found really useful, and I'm actually going to take a sort of mini case study through those techniques, so hopefully you can see how it works. So, we'll start with a definition. And I do have a good definition to show you, but before I get on to the technical definition, I wanted to start with an example. And there's a topic in the UK which is really quite controversial at the moment. Back in September 2011, there was a major media storm around an IT project that had been running for a few years in the UK. Back in 2002, our National Health Service, so the service which runs hospitals and employs doctors and nurses, etc., decided to computerise its patient record keeping. And they were going to have a single national IT system to keep all patient records on. So if you became ill, the doctor, wherever you were, would be able to look up your records and see what treatment you had in the past. Now the trouble was that data was dispersed across different systems on paper, in doctors' surgeries, and the project faced huge problems from the beginning. Now in 2011, the reason that there was such media interest was the project was cancelled. The project was cancelled in 2011 after 9 years of running and having delivered virtually no benefit and virtually none of the original scope. Now the cost was 11 billion UK pounds. I mean, that's like about 17 billion US dollars. And to put that in context, I mean, it was a hospital system. That's about enough to pay the wages of 60,000 nurses for a decade. So, as a UK taxpayer, I care about that a lot. So, the National Audit Office, which is an independent body in the UK, was auditing this project throughout, and they kept saying, this project is going to crash and burn, it's going to fail. The reason being that it was trying to solve the wrong problem to start with. It was trying to solve a problem in the wrong way, and the problem didn't exist in the way that the project thought it did. The project essentially had a lack of enterprise analysis up front and a lack of business analysis throughout. But it's that enterprise analysis, doing the right thing, understanding the problem I'm going to talk about today, which helps us as a community of practitioners to avoid those project explosions when things just fail and explode in our faces. Now, I promised you a definition. The Business Analysis Body of Knowledge, BABOK, from IIBA, provides a pretty good definition of enterprise analysis. And it tells us that enterprise analysis describes the business analysis activities necessary to identify a business need, problem or opportunity. So it's about understanding that problem space. Define the nature of a solution that meets that need. So there's a subtlety there. I'll put in italics nature. So it's not saying design the solution, it's just saying, kind of figure out the nature that the solution might take, and justify the investment necessary to deliver that solution, which is again really important. So going back to Paul's presentation, for those of you that were present, he had that business case part on his hierarchy. So it's about understanding the business case of the project, because ultimately there might be some problems that exist that it's just not worth solving financially. So, if you think about what projects do and the analysis that happens in projects, you can sort of boil it down to three broad areas: the why, the what, and the how. So when projects first start, ideally, we're really looking at the why. We're looking to understand, okay, what's the problem here? What problem are we trying to solve? Do we even know what the problem is? Because so often projects start, I mean, I don't know if you find the same, but I've found that problems start because someone has a great idea, and all of a sudden they rock up into work on a Monday and say, right, don't want to use Oracle on demand anymore, we want Salesforce CRM, salesforce.com, because that's flavour of the month. And you kind of have to say, okay, right, well, we can do that, and it probably is a very good system, but let's understand a bit more about why it is you want that and what need you're trying to meet. So we'll start by understanding why, which is about understanding the problem, understanding the nature of the idea, and also, fundamentally, understanding the money aspect. So what does it cost and what benefits will it bring? What benefits will it bring to the business and what benefits will it bring to our customers? Once we've got an understanding of that, that's when we can start talking about what. So what are our requirements? What capabilities might the business need in order to solve that problem, or to leverage that opportunity, and fundamentally to realise that big stack of money there? Once we've got an understanding of that, we can start thinking about, okay, how will we actually do it? What systems might we implement? What IT systems, what business process change, etc. And these aren't distinct phases. They very much interact. There's a sort of iteration as you go through. You understand more about the why as you go through the project, etc. So it doesn't matter whether you're agile or waterfall. You're generally speaking going to need a slice of all of these. Now, remember, the definition of enterprise analysis was very much about the business problem, the business benefit, etc. So you might initially think that it sits entirely in this why phase. It's all about understanding why we're doing what we're doing. But actually, it also needs an understanding of, to some extent, what's necessary. We need to have a high-level understanding, really, really high-level understanding of what our requirements are. It's that million-mile-high view. And we probably need to have a little bit of an understanding of how we might do it, because we need to know it's possible, we need to know it's feasible, just at a conceptual level. So that's broadly where our enterprise analysis bit sits. And I often think of enterprise analysis as the foundations of projects. So I don't know if you've ever worked on a project where you try to prioritise requirements, and the stakeholders say, okay, yeah, these are really easy to prioritise because they're all must-haves. Has anyone ever had that? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. I'm glad it's not just me. And when you boil it down, often that happens because there isn't a foundation, a consistent foundation of the project in terms of understanding why the project's being run. So if you think about the why are we doing it, what's the benefit? If that view is consistent, then prioritisation becomes easier. Because you can take two requirements and say, okay, which of those requirements is most aligned to why we're doing this project? Which of those requirements will deliver more of that financial benefit that we're trying to obtain? So it gives us these firm foundations. Now the reality is lots of projects run without foundations, they run without a good understanding of the why, and things like prioritisation can become difficult. But if you build a house without foundations, and the sort of earth moves as it does, you get cracks in the walls. And The same is true on projects. If that firm foundation isn't there, you start to see cracks appearing really quickly. In a worst case scenario, you can get that perfect storm where one group of stakeholders thinks you're trying to solve one problem, and another group of stakeholders thinks you're trying to solve a slightly different problem. And what probably will happen in those circumstances is you'll solve neither, and no one will be happy, when the project's launched. So the good news is that the tools and techniques we're going to talk about, whilst ideally it would be great if we could always use them at the beginning of projects before projects have been set up, equally, if you get to that point, that horrible realisation that we've probably all had, where you find that the foundations aren't there, you can also take a step back with your stakeholders and encourage them to just go through this process. Now the challenge, of course, is that when it comes to business requirements, business stakeholders, there's often a difference between what they need and what they say they want. They might say they want one thing, but when we carry out analysis, actually that's really not going to address their problem. And it reminds me of having headaches and taking painkillers. Because, if you go home from work one evening and you have a headache, you probably reach for the medicine cabinet and you take an aspirin or a paracetamol or whatever and your headache goes away. And then the next day, if you've still got a headache, you might take another one. But if you're doing that every day, you probably better go and see a doctor and find out the cause of your headache, because by taking painkillers, all you're really doing is treating the symptoms. The challenge is that projects are often initiated to treat the symptoms. So what we end up doing is giving the organisation a really big dose of aspirin, we build a tactical solution, and then over time we end up with that crazy situation where we've got all these tactical solutions that make any change really difficult. So if those of you that saw Paul's presentation earlier, Paul was mentioning a client of his that have 47 different systems that they have to change whenever there's a regulatory change. It's just a huge undertaking. So another really important part of enterprise analysis is differentiating the want from the need. So making sure stakeholders get what they need. So how can we do that? Well, I've said up front that most of my presentation is going to be a thin slice through this, a sort of practical demonstration, if you will. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about developing a project concept. So if you imagine someone's had that light bulb idea and they rock up to your desk on Monday and say, right, got a brilliant idea, this is what I want to do. I want to implement XYZ system. This is a set of tools and techniques that you can use to get to the root problem. Now, we're limited on time, so I will go through them relatively quickly, but I'm around all day, so if any of this really resonates with you and you want to talk it through, just grab me. So what do I mean by project concept? Well, what I'm talking about is getting a really high-level view, ideally pre-project, so ideally before the project started, of the problem or opportunity that the organisation is addressing. Because ultimately, most projects, most changes are going to be in response to a problem or opportunity. Something's changed in the environment that means we need to make a change. And a very high conceptual level view on the requirements that would need to be met in order for that business need to be addressed. So going back to that definition, it's about understanding the business need, what requirements we might have to meet that need, and also the likely solutions that could be considered at that very high level. And this is literally the sort of thing that if you can get your stakeholders together in one place, you can probably do in a single session, if you're lucky. So going back to our why, what and how, what I'm going to show you now is really just a thin slice through all three areas of three parts of those areas, which will help us to determine the business need, value, and it will inform the scope of any project which we run. So a really neat technique. So I'll start off with it's actually a really succinct technique which is almost so simple it's sometimes overlooked, and that's the technique of the problem statement. I'd be intrigued. Raise your hand if you've ever used a problem statement before. Okay, phew, that's good. That's good. Yeah, and the beauty of the problem statement, I find, is that it very succinctly and precisely articulates a problem so that stakeholders can have a common understanding of it. Now, a way of deriving a problem statement or eliciting a problem statement is to use a really simple and intuitive set of statements. You can start by saying the problem of some particular problem affects some stakeholder community, probably, the impact of which is presumably some negative impact, and a successful solution would probably deliver some benefit and might have some other acceptance criteria associated with it. And you can literally write this in half a page of A4, you can write it on an index card. The really neat thing is that by working with stakeholders to articulate this, we're asking 4 really fundamental questions. We're asking, what problem are we trying to solve? So let's make sure that everyone on the project thinks we're solving the same problem. So you get a unanimous view on that. By finding out who it affects, we get a really good view of who our stakeholders are. So we're even doing some upfront early stakeholder identification, which is really, really useful. By understanding the impact, we're finding out why we should care. Because ultimately, there are problems in the world who have stakeholders which perhaps our business doesn't care about. Perhaps there's not a benefit to solving them. And finally, a successful solution. Well, that's going to tell us what the business benefits are, the customer benefits, and fundamentally, it lets us know how we know when we're done. By defining what success looks like, we can say, right, okay, if we implement something that does that ticks those boxes, we know we've done a good job. And you can literally articulate that in 4 or 5 lines. And the simpler the better. Now the challenge, of course, is that stakeholders don't go around with problem statements in their mind just to kind of reel them off. So we have to work with them to elicit that information. But again, the really good news is the elicitation techniques that we probably all use on a day-to-day basis to elicit detailed requirements are exactly the same stakeholders we can use to elicit information about a problem. So, brainstorming, really great way of working with our stakeholders to get those ideas out. If we've got lots of external customers, we might run a focus group, or perhaps a survey or a questionnaire. We might observe people in action to actually see the problem. And of course, interviews and workshops are the bread and butter of this type of work. So I thought I'd give you an example, because I appreciate it might sound a little bit abstract. So I'm going to introduce a fictitious case study now. So if you imagine a mail-order retail firm, so the sort of place that advertises in magazines, you give them a call to order a product and they send that product to you by courier or by post or whatever. So let's imagine a scenario where the marketing team have a brilliant idea and they set up a new TV advertisement to promote a new offer on one of their products. And that goes out on a Friday afternoon. The weekend comes and customers love it. And they're ringing up to order these products because it's a brilliant price and a brilliant product. They don't just love it a little bit, they love it a lot. So hundreds of customers are ringing. And that's great because the guys on the board are watching, the profits go up and up and up until the whole system collapses, the phone lines are jammed, no one can get through. So then imagine the Monday morning, you come into the office as a business analyst on a Monday morning and you're called into an emergency meeting and the marketing director sort of comes into the office, thumps his fist down on the desk and says, "We need more phone lines. We haven't got enough phone lines to meet our demand." And you say, okay, well, we could run a project to implement new phone lines, but that feels a little bit like aspirin. That feels like painkiller. So you convince this marketing director to take a step back and spend a few minutes with you working through the problem statement. So what would that look like? Well, he starts with, we need more phone lines, and he's shouting and just wanting to get through this. And you ask him a bit more about the problem. And maybe you establish that the problem is actually congested and busy phone lines. So the problem is with demand and capacity. You then ask, who does it affect? And you know it affects customers, but maybe by having a conversation we find out that it's also customers and call centre staff. Because when the call centre's busy, the staff maybe can't take breaks, they get stressed more or whatever, so there's another important stakeholder group there. And then maybe we ask what the impact is, and we find that, well, we're losing potential sales. That one's pretty clear. And then we say, okay, what would a successful solution look like? And perhaps we find that actually it's about enabling customers to get information and make purchases quickly without holding. And that would lead to increased revenues and profits. Now, I don't know an awful lot about call centre technology, but what I do know, and you can probably see as well, is that by just going through that relatively quick, simple process, we've been able to turn this demand for more phone lines into something a bit more holistic. Because you can imagine, if our real aim is to enable customers to get information and make a purchase quickly, well, there are lots of ways of achieving that. You know, maybe we could implement a new website and put an e-commerce solution on it, or maybe we could accept orders by email. So suddenly we widen out our solution opportunities. Now that's a really good start of our foundations, but it's by no means the end. So the next thing is to drill down and understand, okay, well, what does success really mean? So if we go back to our definition of enterprise analysis, part of it was about understanding the financial justification. So we need to understand really what does this mean for us. And a really good way of doing that is to use critical success factors and key performance indicators to define success. By critical success factor, what I'm talking about is some generally qualitative statement which explains what success looks like for the business in the context of this project. So to give you an example, for this project that I'm talking about, we might say that a critical success factor is excellent customer service. So it's a high-level, broad objective. You could then take that and delve down and say, okay, well, if excellent customer service is our critical success factor, how would we measure that? And you could assign a key performance indicator against it. And maybe in this example, we'd say, well, call waiting time. That's how we'll measure success. The shorter the better, or whatever. So it's very much... This has gone to sleep, so let's... it's back. It's very much about saying what conditions must be met for the project to be a success. And equally, if we came back in 12 months' time, how would we actually assess how successful the project's been? Now, stakeholders won't, or if you have stakeholders that do, you're really lucky, but stakeholders generally don't think like this. They don't think in critical success factors and KPIs. So there's a framework we can use to help them. And that is the good old balanced business scorecard. And this is a really, it's a fairly standard technique that's used in a lot of places. And you can use it to help define strategy at an organisational level, but you can also use it at a micro level on a project. So what you can do is go with your stakeholders round this scorecard and start by saying, okay, financially, when we succeed, when we solve that problem that we've just defined, what does it mean for us financially? And they might say, okay, well, we'll be more profitable. Okay, right, so perhaps a critical success factor is a more profitable business or a profitable business. How could we measure that? What are the key performance indicators? And we can delve down. For customer, we might say, okay, what would our customers gain from this? And maybe it's a better customer experience. Okay, that sounds like a critical success factor. How would we measure that? And then we define some key performance indicators. What internal processes might we need to excel at? So maybe for our retailer, we find that logistics is really important. We need to be able to shift them through relatively quickly. And finally, learning and innovation. What do we need to future-proof? Again, in this example, perhaps we say, well, the thing we really need to future-proof is we need to ensure that whatever we do is scalable. So if we do have a new marketing campaign, that we can meet the demand next time. So we learn from the mistake that this case study taught that organisation. So what we then end up with is sort of a bit of a hierarchy in our foundations. We have the problem statement at the very top. We've got critical success factors in probably all of those areas, and some key performance indicators which enable us to measure that. So that gives us a really good foundational view of why the project initiative change is necessary. The next question is, okay, how can we define at a really broad level what our requirements might be to solve that problem? Now, a technique I'm going to talk about is roles and goals. And this is a technique that you can run with people in, if you're fortunate enough to have everyone in one place, the best way of doing it is to run it with, or I've found, is to give people lots of these little sticky notes and get them to sort of write on them and stick them on walls. If you're not in one place, you can do a similar thing over web conferencing, if you've got access to web conferencing systems. But it's all around sort of brainstorming. And the first thing is to say, okay, right, so we've defined our problem. Who are our stakeholders that are involved with, influenced by, or affected by, or have some level of interest in that problem? And who might need to interact with any systems or processes that are in the domain of that problem? So taking our call centre example, who's actually involved with this problem of order management or whatever it happens to be? Now, a role doesn't have to represent a single job title. It's really any user or stakeholder with similar characteristics. And what you can do is literally get people to note every idea down, stick them on a board somewhere. You'll probably get some duplication and you can shuffle them around. But by the end of 10-15 minutes, you'll have a pretty good view of everyone who's got some level of involvement. What you can then do is say, okay, for each of these stakeholders, for each of these roles, why do they care about this problem? What does solving this problem mean for them? Or to put that another way, taking the systems and processes that we're potentially changing or whatever, what are they actually trying to achieve? It's generally better to keep it very high level in terms of verb-noun. So, perhaps one of the key things that one of the stakeholders is doing, they might be entering an order, for example. We don't necessarily care what the details of that order are, we just want to understand the scope of broadly what they're doing. So what you then end up with is you end up with a list of stakeholders who potentially could be users of any solution we implement, and you end up with a list of goals for those users. So if you take each stakeholder in turn, look at their goals, and those goals are sort of broad functions or features that we might need. Now, I mentioned brainstorming. The best way to brainstorm, if you've got stakeholders in a room with these sort of sticky notes, or even if you've got them on a web conference, a few rules which work really well. One is try and get everyone to suspend judgment. So often when people come up with ideas or roles or goals, they want to talk about it, which is totally natural, but what I and my colleagues have found works the best is just get them to write it, say it and stick it, and then go on to their next idea. And the judgment, the conversation, that can happen later. What that does is it enables lateral thinking to happen, so people can see the ideas of others and then they have their own ideas to add. I would also recommend going quite quickly. So I've literally set brainstorming sessions and I've given people 7 minutes and they come up with, you wouldn't believe the number of ideas people come up with in 7 minutes sometimes. Okay, so perhaps we run this exercise for our call centre and we find that we have 2 obvious roles. We have the customer and the call centre agent. But we do a little bit more brainstorming and we encourage our stakeholders to think a bit more. And they say, well actually, we've also got a call centre supervisor. And maybe they're a really critical stakeholder who've got some distinct requirements. Maybe they get some reports out of whatever system we're already using. Maybe there's a scheduler who actually schedules the people to be on the phones at particular times. There might be an infrastructure support team, and they're going to be really key stakeholders, because if we do end up implementing more phone lines, perhaps it'll be them that support them. And maybe we find a wild card. We find that the CEO's assistant is also a really important stakeholder, because they actually create reports for the CEO about the number of sales. So what we could then do is take each stakeholder, each role in turn, and say, what do they do? So our customer, what do they do? Well, maybe the broad things that they do are make purchases, make inquiries, ask about current special offers, chase late deliveries, request service, and occasionally probably complain, because no organisation gets it right all the time. Well, that's useful, and we can go around every stakeholder and get those list of goals, but of course, not all of those goals are we going to want to bring into our project. So the next question is, okay, what are we actually going to worry about? So framing that question differently, which of those goals are we actually going to investigate, automate, improve, or change? And what new capabilities might the business require to solve the problem we originally defined? And from that, you can figure out which roles are impacted. A pretty intuitive, neat way of doing this is to take each goal and put it into one of these 3 categories. There'll be some goals that you look at and the organisation says, do you know what? Our organisation does that pretty well already. So we might say that actually making purchases, we do that really well already. It's an existing goal and we satisfy it and we're completely happy with that. Those are the things which are probably not going to be in the scope of your project. There may be some goals that are partially satisfied by existing systems and processes or not satisfied at all. For those goals, we probably might consider including them in our scope. And there might be brand new goals that this problem or opportunity has created for us. We've got a whole new set of goals. Again, they're good contenders for being in the scope. So perhaps in our call centre example, we say, well actually, now we think of it, making purchases and making inquiries and complaining, as an organisation we actually do that really well. That wasn't really our problem. The problem was one of capacity and demand. And actually, do you know what? We reckon if we could cut down on the 80% of calls we get which are asking about the current special offers, then we could solve the problem. So if we automate or change these 3 goals, we can solve our problem. So we make that, we do some digging and make that assessment. What that gives us then is a situation where we've got a good definition of the problem and a good definition of the sort of functional scope that our project would have. Now, it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to think that the roles and goals that we create at this high level could become other artefacts throughout the project lifecycle. So the fairly sort of logical one is they could become actors and use cases, maybe, if you're using actors and use cases. Clearly you need further elaboration to do that. But it's not just use cases. If you were using user stories, you could write sort of epic level user stories around your roles and goals. If you're doing data modelling, you could look out for the nouns. So anywhere there's a noun, that's probably a data entity. So if you've got create customer, then customer's probably a data entity. If you're doing process modelling, then your actors are probably, involved in some of the processes. So it helps you downstream as well. So what you end up with by this point is a firm set of foundations outlining the problem, outlining the benefits that solving it will achieve, and at a high level of the functional scope. The other part of enterprise analysis that we talked about was understanding what solutions might be available. And that is really a case of, again, probably brainstorming, researching, speaking to your IT architecture colleagues to find out what's out there. There are always a number of options. You can build new software, you can extend, you can buy, you can lease. There's a lot of software as a service out there these days. You might also make a process change, an organisational change, and you might outsource some problems, you might insource problems. So it's very much about working with colleagues to understand what solutions are available and creating that initial list. Now, once you have that view, again, at a very, very high conceptual level, you've got an understanding of the problem, understanding of the requirements, understanding of the benefits, and a list of potential solutions. Another thing, if you've got the time and the opportunity, which is very useful, is to, at that high level, get some view of whether any of those solutions can be eliminated early on. Because if you've got a list of like 20 possible solutions, that's probably too many to manage. So a quick gap analysis saying, okay, well, which of those solutions will actually meet those conceptual requirements in order to solve that problem? So you then reach the point where you've got the foundations and you've got a list of solutions. And what that enables project stakeholders to do is really make informed decisions about whether they want the project to continue. Because even at this early stage, they might say, we can see there's significant benefit in that, so yes, let's progress to an outline business case, or whatever you need. Now, a couple of thoughts in closing. I talked about foundations and about how enterprise analysis is like the foundations of a house. It's the foundations of a well-made project. It's about doing the right things so that we can then do them right. Well, when you get those foundations, they last. So if you've got a project that has well thought through enterprise analysis, you can go back 6-7 years if you want to after the project has implemented and say, okay, was this project actually a success? Let's look back at those critical success factors and figure out whether it really delivered the benefit we wanted. And also, as the project continues, things like prioritisation will be easier because you've got those foundations in place. But environments can change. And if you think, or if you and your team think you're building a house in a city and your stakeholders have changed their mind and now want to live on a swamp somewhere, the foundations are probably going to be quite different. You're probably going to have to build a house on stilts or something here. And the same is true on projects. If scope significantly changes, it's really important as a community of practitioners for us to go back to our stakeholders and say, right, okay, are we still trying to solve this same problem? Because if we're not, let's figure out what problem we are trying to solve. And in doing that, we'll help avoid those situations, like the example I opened with, where money in projects gets wasted and doesn't deliver benefit. And we'll ensure that our projects are smoother and deliver the benefits that our stakeholders ultimately expect, need and want. Okay, so, well, thank you again for inviting me here. It's really good to be in Kiev today. I really would like to stay in touch, so if any of you are on Twitter, I'm quite a prolific tweeter, so do tweet me, and I blog as well, and you can take a look at my website. I'm around at the conference today. I think we're very shortly about to run into time. Do we have any time for any questions?
About 1 minute.
About 1 minute. Does anyone have a 30-second question? Go.
What to do when the problem statement is like, we need to earn more money?
We need to add more money?
Yeah, to earn more money.
To create more profit. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a very broad problem. So
yeah, but it's really generic. So
yeah.
how to approach it?
I think that what you would need to do is then understand how the business is currently making money, and whether there are, because ultimately, you know, really all you can do to make more money is increase revenue or reduce costs. That's broadly all you can do, and then look for opportunities to increase revenue or reduce costs. And we're out of time.
Yes, we are out of time, but now we have a big break. Yes, so if any have any questions, so please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much.